A flight attendant scans the passengers as the plane prepares for takeoff. Suddenly, her eyes freeze on a woman in row 12, a quiet traveler clutching something hidden under her coat. When turbulence shakes the plane, the object falls into the aisle, a rare military medal, one only awarded to heroes who risk everything. The crew realizes they're not just serving a passenger, they're sitting beside a story that could change the way everyone on board sees her. The hum of jet engines filled the cabin as passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, searching for their seats. For the flight attendants, it was another routine boarding. Business travelers with laptops, families juggling snacks, and restless kids, students lost in headphones. It was the usual crowd. Nothing stood out. Nothing unusual. Except for the woman in row 12. She boarded quietly, carrying only a small leather bag and a worn coat folded across her arm. Her hair was neatly tied back, her face calm but unreadable, the kind of expression that made her blend into the background. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't demanding, and she didn't draw attention the way some passengers do. If anything, she seemed to want to disappear into her seat. The crew barely noticed her at first. She smiled politely, gave a nod when asked about her luggage, and slid into her window seat with practiced ease, as though she had done this countless times before. To anyone watching, she was just another traveler heading somewhere far away. But there was something about the way she sat straight-backed, alert, as though she was both present and somewhere else entirely. The flight attendant passing down the aisle couldn't help but notice her hands. She held her coat tightly against her chest, fingers curled around it like it carried something fragile, something she wasn't ready to let go of. The boarding doors closed. The safety demonstration began. The aircraft rumbled toward the runway. Everything was ordinary. Then, during the climb, the plane shuddered through a pocket of turbulence. Coffee sloshed, overhead bins rattled, and passengers let out a few nervous laughs. And that's when it happened. The woman's coat slipped from her lap. Something small and metallic tumbled onto the floor with a soft clink. The sound was drowned out by the engines, but the flash of polished bronze caught the eye of the nearest flight attendant. She bent down instinctively, reaching to hand it back, and froze. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't a keychain. It was a medal. Not just any medal. The kind of medal most people would only ever see behind glass in a museum or pinned to the chest of someone in uniform on a day of national honor. Heavy. Official. Etched with history. The attendant's hand hovered above it for a second too long. When she finally picked it up, she glanced at the passenger in row 12 with new eyes. The woman looked stricken, almost embarrassed. She reached out quickly, murmuring, "Thank you," and pulled the medal back into her hands, tucking it deep into her coat, as though hoping no one else had noticed. But at least 3 people had. And in that moment, row 12 was no longer invisible. The hum of the engines masked most conversations, but inside the cabin, a subtle shift had already begun. A handful of passengers had seen the object that slipped from the woman's coat, and whispers rippled like a quiet current through row 12 and beyond. The flight attendant who retrieved it couldn't help but look again. She had seen medals before. Her grandfather had one tucked away in a velvet box, but this wasn't the kind handed out lightly. This one carried weight. On its surface gleamed a crest, an inscription etched so finely that even in the dim cabin lighting, it caught the eye. This wasn't a souvenir. This was a decoration of valor, the kind reserved for acts that went beyond duty, beyond expectation, sometimes beyond survival. The attendant hesitated before speaking. "That's quite a medal," she said softly, careful not to intrude. The woman in row 12 gave a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's nothing," she replied, tucking the medal deeper into her coat pocket. Her voice was polite but firm, the universal tone of someone who wasn't inviting questions. But silence is fragile, especially on an airplane where curiosity spreads faster than turbulence. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man leaned forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but insistent. "Is that what I think it is?" The woman's shoulders stiffened. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, almost reluctantly, she nodded. The passengers nearby exchanged glances. Recognition sparked. Some didn't know the exact name of the award, but they knew enough. They knew it belonged to someone who had faced danger most people could only imagine. A young boy in the next row leaned over the seat in front of him. "Did you win it?" he asked with the blunt innocence only a child could manage. The woman in row 12 took a breath. She looked at the boy, then at the medal she still held in her lap, its ribbon worn and slightly frayed. Finally, she shook her head. "You don't win something like this," she said softly. "You survive it." That single sentence hung in the air, heavier than the altitude pressing against the cabin walls. For the first time, people truly looked at her. She wasn't just a quiet traveler anymore. She was someone who had been through something extraordinary, something costly. The crew exchanged glances of their own. Protocol told them to remain professional, to respect privacy, but humanity tugged at them too. They couldn't help but wonder. Who was she? What had she done? What story lived behind that medal? The woman must have felt their stares because she pulled her coat tight once more, eyes fixed firmly on the clouds outside her window. She didn't want attention. She didn't want questions. She wanted to remain just another passenger on just another flight. But it was too late. The medal had spoken for her. And everyone on board was listening. The clouds outside stretched endlessly, white fields against a blue horizon. Inside the cabin, though, there was a different kind of stillness. The woman in row 12 had tried to fade back into anonymity, but the silence around her was expectant, almost reverent. People wanted to know. People needed to know. It started small, just a gentle word from the flight attendant, crouched beside her seat. "You don't have to share," she said softly, "but I think people here already see you differently. Maybe they'd want to hear your story." The woman's hands tightened around the medal. She had carried it for years, hidden it more often than not, because medals weren't always reminders of glory. Sometimes they were reminders of what was lost. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a quiet sigh, she placed the medal on the tray table in front of her, letting the ribbon unfurl. The soft clink of metal against plastic caught the ears of half the cabin. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Her voice was steady but low, as though speaking cost her something. "This was given to me after a mission that didn't go as planned. We were supposed to rescue civilians from a conflict zone. It was dangerous, but we thought we could get in and out. Not everyone made it home. The medal," she touched it gently with her fingertips, "is for what I did. But every time I see it, I think of those who didn't come back." The weight of her words sank deeper than the plane's altitude. The boy who had asked earlier now sat wide-eyed, clutching his armrest. The middle-aged man across the aisle lowered his gaze, ashamed for prying. Even the flight attendants, so used to maintaining composure, found themselves standing a little straighter. Someone began to clap quietly, a single pair of hands from the back of the cabin. It spread slowly, uncertainly at first, then stronger, until the applause filled the plane like rolling thunder. The woman in row 12 shook her head gently, almost embarrassed, but her eyes glistened. "Please," she murmured, "don't clap for me. Clap for them. For the ones who gave everything." And so, the passengers did just that. Not for her alone, but for every unseen figure her medal represented. In that small space above the clouds, strangers became a community, united in respect. When the plane finally touched down and the seatbelt signs chimed off, people didn't rush to disembark like they usually did. They lingered, offering nods, quiet thank yous, even salutes. The woman accepted them with grace, though her eyes kept drifting back to the medal, as if it was both her burden and her compass. Row 12 was no longer anonymous. It was a place where history sat quietly, reminding everyone on board that heroes don't always wear uniforms or seek recognition. Sometimes, they just sit by the window, holding on to a memory heavier than the skies themselves.